Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. A pharmacist, a peaceful farmhouse, a sleeping wife in a camper just steps away. But inside the bedroom, two blasts from a shotgun, no forced entry, no missing items, just a body. And one word pinned into the pillow with a knife. Bitch. She said she heard nothing. 13 years passed before anyone was charged. By then, the facts had grown cold, the evidence faded, and what remained was buried under financial windfalls and a public image too clean to question. This isn't just the story of a murder. It's the unmasking of a staged crime, one that appeared too tidy for comfort, and the silence that followed far too long. It was August 30th, 2006, just before 6:30 a.m., when a call came into Marathon County's Emergency Dispatch Center in Wisconsin. The caller was a woman in her mid-50s. Her tone was steady, her words calculated. She reported her husband had been shot in the chest. Twice, she gave her name, Cindy Schultz-Uedes. Her husband, she said, was inside the house. She had found him in bed, lifeless. She said she'd spent the night sleeping in a camper parked just outside their home on the Dill Creek property in the small town of Hull, Wisconsin. A migraine had driven her to seek quiet away from the bedroom. She awoke early, walked inside, and found him. The man she found was Kenneth Uedes, a 58-year-old licensed pharmacist and co-owner of the Mosinee Pharmacy. He was considered stable, respected, and financially secure. His body was discovered in the master bedroom, face up in bed, with 2 shotgun wounds to the chest. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood trail, no broken windows, no smashed locks, but there was something else. Next to the body, a knife had been stabbed into a pillow. Pinned beneath it was a single sheet of paper, handwritten, the word bitch scrawled across it. Nothing else. No signature. No smudges. No explanation. Deputies on scene later described it as the most bizarre detail in a murder scene that otherwise showed no chaos. Ken was still in sleepwear. The bedding wasn't disturbed. No items in the home were missing. His wallet was left untouched. The television was off. The front door was closed, and Cindy, the only other person known to be on the property, said she hadn't heard a thing. The camper where Cindy claimed she slept was parked about 30 to 40 feet from the front door. No insulation, no TV playing, just the stillness of rural Wisconsin. It was the beginning of what would become a 13-year mystery. Detectives began processing the scene. They photographed the bedroom from every angle, careful not to disturb the knife in the pillow. They dusted for prints, examined every lock, window, latch, and surface. What they found, or rather what they didn't find, would be the first red flag. There were no footprints outside the home that couldn't be accounted for. No mud tracked in from a possible intruder. No glove prints on the door. Nothing stolen. No sign of a forced entry. The scene looked like a controlled environment, not one that had been ambushed. And yet Ken Uedes had been executed at close range with a shotgun. Let's pause here. If you were called to this crime scene, what would you make of it? Would you accept the idea of a stranger breaking into a remote farmhouse, shooting once, then again, leaving a note and taking nothing? Or would you wonder if this was never meant to look like a robbery in the first place? Back at the station, investigators began the first of many interviews with Cindy. In her statement, she repeated what she told Dispatch. She had gone to bed early in the RV. She hadn't seen or heard anything suspicious during the night. She woke up just before 6, walked inside, and found her husband dead. She immediately called 911. Detectives noted her behavior was composed, if not somewhat emotionally distant. She didn't ask to see the body again. She didn't collapse or cry uncontrollably. She was cooperative, but precise. She couldn't recall the last time she'd checked on Ken during the night. She said she never left the camper once she went inside. But one detail stuck with the investigators. Cindy had changed clothes before calling 911. She said she felt too dirty to be seen and needed to clean herself up first. Over the following hours, a clearer picture of the timeline emerged. Ken was last seen alive the evening of August 29th, around 9 p.m. No neighbors reported hearing gunfire. A thunderstorm had passed through overnight, which may have masked any sounds. The medical examiner placed the estimated time of death between 1:30 a.m. and 3 o'clock a.m., based on lividity, body temperature, and gastric content. So the window of the shooting was narrow. And again, only Cindy was known to be on the property during those hours. But this wasn't enough for an arrest. Not yet. There were no fingerprints on the knife, no gun recovered, no blood found anywhere in the house outside the bedroom. No sign of defensive wounds on Ken. The gunshot wounds were described as tight spread, indicating close-range discharge, likely while Ken was already asleep. But who could have come so close, undetected? And why leave behind such a theatrically aggressive message? If the word bitch was meant as a threat, it didn't align with the actual victim. And that alone, according to one detective, was what made it feel performative. From a procedural standpoint, they were stuck. There was no suspect, no clear motive, no witnesses. The only unusual element, the note, was more confusing than helpful. Still, something about Cindy's version of events kept nagging investigators. The RV wasn't soundproof. A shotgun blast, indoors, would have been thunderous. Even from 40 feet away, it would shake windows, jolt anyone from sleep. And yet she claimed she slept through it entirely. It wasn't impossible. But it wasn't easy to believe either. There's a certain expectation with homicide scenes and chaos, a forced door, overturned drawers, a broken window. But the house on Dill Creek Lane didn't fit the template. It was clean, quiet, undisturbed. There were no signs of struggle, no mess, no forced entry. It looked like someone had been let in, or had never left. The first team on site conducted a controlled sweep of the exterior. They worked backward, gravel, grass, mud, windowsills. The conditions that morning were favorable for prints. The ground had softened from rain the day before, yet there were no shoe impressions around the perimeter of the home that didn't belong to responding officers or paramedics. No trampled brush, no scuff marks on the siding, no signs of a struggle or pursuit in the yard. It wasn't impossible for someone to approach carefully, but with a shotgun, in the dark, across rural terrain, without disturbing a single patch of dirt. Inside the house, the scene offered the same uniform sterility. Ken De.ad was still in bed, arms at his sides, pajama shirt unwrinkled. No defensive wounds were noted, no blood on his hands, no bruising. The bed sheets were pulled up neatly to his chest, not shoved down, not twisted. The positioning told them something. He had been asleep when he was shot. That was consistent with the ME's early findings. Both wounds, one to the chest, one just below the collarbone, were made at close range. The spread from the shotgun was tight. No sign of a third shot. Both rounds were lethal. The medical examiner noted the angle of entry matched the victim's sleeping posture. The time of death was estimated between 1:30 and 3 o'clock a.m., based on internal temperature, rigor onset, and stomach contents. Ken had eaten a late dinner, a hamburger and salad, which remained partially undigested. Meanwhile, Cindy's account remained unchanged. She said she'd gone to the RV around 9:45 p.m. Took Tylenol p.m. Fell asleep, woke up at dawn, walked inside, found her husband shot dead. But there was one problem. A 12-gauge shotgun blast fired indoors at close range is not a quiet event. Even through walls, even during storms, the decibel level can exceed 150, louder than a firecracker in your hand. In open air, a shot can be heard for a quarter mile. At night, sound carries farther. The RV Cindy slept in was parked no more than 40 feet from the house. There was no insulation, no white noise machine, no TV running. She claimed to have heard nothing. Not one shot, not two. Detectives found that hard to believe. But disbelief is not evidence. And at this point, there was nothing physical to contradict her version. One deputy noted in his report that her behavior seemed too measured. She hadn't asked if Ken had suffered. She hadn't asked whether it could have been a robbery. Her questions centered on procedure, where she could sit, who she'd need to speak to next, how soon she'd be allowed back inside the house. That by itself wasn't incriminating. People react to trauma differently. But when you combine emotional detachment with an absence of forensic chaos, the inconsistencies begin to stand out. The kitchen had been untouched, the garage undisturbed. Ken's wallet was still in his jeans, hanging on the back of a chair. The TV remote was sitting beside him, unused. There were no missing electronics, no signs of anything being rifled through, nothing pointed to a burglary, and yet the note, the knife stabbed through the pillow, implied rage, targeted hostility. But the word written was not directed at Ken, and Ken, as far as anyone could tell, hadn't made enemies. So what was it supposed to mean? One detective, reviewing the crime scene photos that same week, noted in a private internal summary, the data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. A few days later, crime scene technicians delivered a full trace analysis. No unfamiliar fingerprints were recovered, no partials on the door, the bed frame, or the knife. There were no foreign hairs or fibers, no gloves or clothing left behind. What they did find was a complete lack of physical intrusion. The only footprints near the doors, both front and back, belonged to emergency responders. The only DNA present in the bed was Ken's. No sign that the sheets had been changed, washed, or disturbed after the shooting. So again, the question returned. How could an unknown assailant enter this house, shoot a man twice with a shotgun, plant a knife in his pillow, and leave without leaving behind a single trace? Either the killer was incredibly prepared, or they had time to clean, time to stage, time to control the narrative. Outside of the crime scene, detectives began working through known associates, pharmacy coworkers, neighbors, extended family. They asked about recent threats, financial stress, disputes. Nothing surfaced. Ken had no known enemies, no legal battles, no criminal record, no ex-wife, no evidence of an affair, no debt. He was a pharmacist in a small town. His days were routine, the kind of person about whom neighbors said he'd give you the shirt off his back. That's not anecdotal. It was logged in at least 3 separate interviews. If there was a motive to kill this man, it wasn't personal in the traditional sense. But one fact was starting to shape the direction of the case. Ken Judy's was worth nearly $1 million in life insurance, and at the time of his death, only one person stood to inherit it directly. Still, it was too early to draw conclusions. The case needed physical evidence. The absence of forced entry wasn't enough. The noise concerns? Circumstantial. The clean crime scene? Suspicious, but not proof. But something else was coming. A closer look into the camper and the home's interior layout would raise new flags. Not because of what was found, but what wasn't. And that would be the turning point. When the forensic trail goes cold, investigators shift their focus, not to where the killer may have entered, but to what the victim left behind. And in the case of Kenneth Judes, what remained was an orderly life on paper. But paperwork, like people, can lie by omission. Ken Judes was known in Hull, Wisconsin as the dependable pharmacist. He co-owned the Mazzini Pharmacy, long hours, consistent habits, no criminal history. On the surface, he lived a life of stability and modest success. But in homicide cases, stability is not an endpoint. It's a premise that demands pressure testing. In the week following the murder, detectives began a full review of Ken's recent transactions, insurance documents, and property holdings. They obtained a warrant to collect bank records, review financial correspondence, and examine digital files stored on both his home and pharmacy computers. One file immediately stood out. It was a scanned life insurance policy, dated just 1 year prior, listing Cindy Schultz Juedes as the sole beneficiary. The policy was valued at $200,000, but that was only the start. A second, much larger policy, nearly $760,000, had been added to the file directory 3 months before Ken's death. Again, the same beneficiary, same mailing address, same policy issuer. Investigators began interviewing Ken's professional network. A business partner at the pharmacy recalled Ken talking about reviewing his estate plans in early summer 2006. He'd asked about legal templates for modifying beneficiaries. One colleague remembered Ken saying, "I've been thinking about setting things up differently just in case." He hadn't elaborated. The working theory took form quietly. If Ken had been preparing to change the direction of his financial legacy, the motive for someone close to him to act preemptively could not be ruled out. Detectives reviewed the timeline again. Cindy reported the body just after 6 a.m. on August 30th. By the end of that same week, she had made preliminary contact with the insurance company, not to ask if the claim could be processed, but to inquire whether Ken had filed changes to his beneficiary designation in recent months. It was a specific question. The insurance representative, in a later deposition, stated Cindy had sounded concerned that any recent activity on the file might delay the payout. The company responded that, to their knowledge, no beneficiary update had been recorded. The policy stood as written. She would receive the full benefit. When investigators asked Cindy about the conversation, she said she was trying to get ahead of the paperwork. In itself, that wasn't evidence of wrongdoing. But the timing, combined with Ken's informal conversations about updating his will, created a tension point that couldn't be ignored. Behind closed doors, detectives began comparing timelines. The date Ken allegedly started researching insurance changes, June 2006, the last seen communication from him about financial reallocation, mid-August, the day he died, August 30th, the day Cindy called the insurance company, September 2nd, 4 days. As part of the financial analysis, detectives also reviewed the property itself. Dill Creek Farm was not just a home, it was acreage, assets, and real estate value. It had appreciated steadily. Ken's name was listed as primary owner on all deeds, with Cindy as co-owner only in survivorship, meaning, in the event of his death, full ownership transferred to her, no probate required. The combined value of Ken's life insurance and the property exceeded $1 million. By the 10th day of the investigation, detectives weren't just examining a murder. They were reviewing what could be considered a financial pivot point, but they still lacked direct evidence. There was no weapon, no confession, no physical trace that placed anyone at the scene except Cindy, and her presence was already established. So they looked further into behavioral anomalies, a pattern of statements, actions that didn't fit the moment. One detail came from a neighbor. During canvassing, a woman living 2 parcels down reported something odd. On the morning of August 30th, she said she saw Cindy near the road around 6:00 a.m., standing still, not waving, not calling for help, just standing. When asked why she hadn't mentioned this earlier, the neighbor said she hadn't realized it mattered. She assumed Cindy had been waiting for law enforcement. That observation, passive but unsettling, was logged. When cross-referenced with 911 call records, the timeline aligned. But the posture didn't. Why stand by the road and wait when your spouse is dead inside the house? Why not flag down help immediately? These weren't accusations, but they were questions, quiet ones, the kind that accumulate and over time form patterns. There's a concept in homicide investigation that applies here: preemptive positioning. It refers to a suspect taking actions not just to cover a crime, but to manage its aftermath. That includes quick legal filings, insurance inquiries, public behavior that appears mournful but controlled. Cindy Schultz-Uedes had followed all necessary steps. She'd called 911, she'd given her account, she'd answered police questions. But what investigators were now examining was not what she did, but how fast she did it. In homicide investigations, silence can be its own kind of evidence. The absence of noise, struggle, or panic doesn't clear suspicion. It can sharpen it. That's what investigators faced as they moved deeper into the physical logistics of the Dill Creek farmhouse. By week 2, forensic examiners returned to the layout. They focused on distances, door-to-bed, camper-to-bedroom wall, sound levels between structures, to test whether Cindy Schultz-Uedes' account was physically plausible. Her claim? She slept in the RV outside the house due to a migraine. She heard nothing. No gunshots, no movement, nothing unusual until sunrise. The distance between the RV and the master bedroom window was about 35 to 40 feet, unobstructed. The wall construction was wood frame, not concrete. No insulation specific to soundproofing. There was no running generator, no recorded rainfall during the estimated time of death. And the weapon used, a 12-gauge shotgun, produces a blast measured between 155 and 165 decibels at close range. That's louder than a jet engine at takeoff. Detectives brought in a sound expert from a nearby technical college to conduct acoustic replication tests under similar environmental conditions. The goal was straightforward: determine whether a person inside the camper, under normal sleeping conditions, could realistically sleep through 2 shotgun blasts fired indoors during nighttime silence. The result was conclusive. From inside the camper, the shots were unmistakable. The windows rattled. The structure vibrated. Sound leaked in from every panel. Anyone inside would have woken instantly, especially on the second blast. Sleep through it. Highly unlikely. But that wasn't all. They reviewed the layout of the bedroom itself. Ken's body had been found on the left side of the bed. The pillow next to him, not beneath him, bore the knife and note. The sheets weren't twisted. There was no evidence of sudden movement, no contusions or bruises on Ken's arms, face, or neck. His hands showed no trace of gunpowder residue or defensive injury. He never moved. This aligned with the medical examiner's final report. Ken De.ad was likely unconscious or asleep when shot. The spread pattern of pellets was tight, confirming close range. The position of the entry wounds, mid-chest, slightly angled downward, matched someone firing from the edge of the bed while the victim lay flat. And that meant something else. The killer stood close, within 3 to 4 feet, maybe closer. Not an entry from a window, not a rushed hallway ambush. Whoever pulled that trigger stood over Ken while he slept and fired, not once but twice, with precision. Yet there were still no prints on the door, no unknown DNA, no blood trail outside the room. The crime scene was confined, contained, neatly executed. So the forensic unit did one more test. They collected fiber samples from the bedding, the bedroom rug, and the hallway floor, then cross-referenced them with samples from the RV's interior carpet. They found matching particulates, microscopic red fibers, embedded in the master bedroom threshold and near the entrance of the RV. That wasn't definitive, but it supported proximity, movement between structures. Someone had traveled between the house and camper, possibly after the murder. Meanwhile, law enforcement returned to Cindy's initial timeline. She claimed to have entered the house after dawn, saw Ken in bed, and immediately called 911, but she also admitted to changing clothes before making the call. Investigators asked, why would someone delay calling for help after finding their spouse shot to death? To change clothes. Her answer, she didn't want to be seen looking messy. She thought she might have to talk to officers face to face. That explanation was documented, but it did not sit well with the investigative team. In a homicide, delay matters. Delay changes time of discovery, potential lividity movement, temperature gradients. A 5-minute gap can be procedural. A 15-minute gap can alter the scene. Cindy's delay wasn't 5 minutes. Based on scene estimates, it was closer to 20. In fact, when dispatch records were matched to neighbor observations, one witness had seen Cindy standing outside the property near the mailbox at 6:08 a.m., almost 15 minutes before her 911 call was recorded. She had stood alone, not flagging anyone, not visibly distressed, just standing. One investigator summarized the disconnect in a field note. The timeline she gives doesn't conflict with time of death, it conflicts with urgency. It was a subtle point, but one that shifted the case from unanswered to increasingly inconsistent. And as more of these contradictions stacked up, timing, sound, movement, reaction, the case began to move beyond the bedroom. Because if Cindy's version of events didn't align with science, the investigation would have to ask, was it a failure of memory or fabrication? In early 2007, 6 months after the killing, the investigation into Kenneth De.ad's murder had gone from reactive to reconstructive. Forensic evidence was no longer about catching a suspect in the act. It was now about rebuilding the night backward. Ken had been shot in his bed with a 20-gauge shotgun, twice in the chest. No gun had ever been recovered, and there was no sign of forced entry. But the scene, as preserved by officers from the Marathon County Sheriff's Office, offered another detail investigators couldn't let go of. It was too clean. Despite the chaotic premise, a man shot point-blank in his own home, a crude note stabbed into the pillow beside his head with a knife, there was a strange absence of the usual forensic markers. No bloody footprints, no glove prints, no weapon residue, no DNA foreign to the household. But something stood out. The pillowcase, the knife handle, the doorknob, the shotgun shell fragments, all were wiped clean. This told investigators something important. Whoever killed Ken wasn't panicking. They had time. What made this chilling wasn't just the level of preparation. It was that the killer appeared to know what to avoid. The absence of fingerprints wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. Investigators re-reviewed Cindy Schultz De.ad's original statement. According to her, she had spent the night before the murder sleeping alone in a camper trailer outside the house because of a migraine. She claimed to have found Ken's body around 8 a.m. and then drove to a neighbor's house to call 911. But there was a time gap. Forensics placed Ken's time of death between midnight and 2:30 a.m. The 911 call came over 5 hours later. What was Cindy doing in that gap? Detectives examined the RV she claimed to have slept in. It was unlocked when they arrived and contained a used blanket and pillow, evidence consistent with someone having rested there. But the temperature that night had dropped to the high 40s, and there was no sign the trailer's heater had been used. Cindy's car, parked near the RV, was also inspected. Investigators found nothing overtly suspicious inside. No weapons, no blood, no transfer evidence from the scene. Still, something about her story didn't sit right. Then came the fingerprint inconsistency. Lab results showed no usable fingerprints anywhere in the master bedroom, despite it being the couple's primary living space. The knife that pinned the note to the pillow, one of the few items not moved or tampered with, had zero prints, not even smudges. In a household where two people lived full-time, that absence alone became forensic noise. One of the investigators noted in their internal memo, "The absence of evidence is evidence. There is no randomness here." It was becoming clear that the killer had wiped the scene clean of any contact points, but hadn't staged it to look like a robbery or sexual assault. And there was no ransacking, no valuables taken. Even Ken's wallet remained on the dresser. As the forensic vacuum widened, attention shifted to motive. If this wasn't a random home invasion, what was it? The insurance documents provided part of the answer. After Ken's death, Cindy had initiated claims on multiple policies, including one nearly worth $1 million. The insurance companies flagged the filings as unusually prompt. In fact, one insurer had received a claim form from Cindy just days after the murder, before the death certificate had even been finalized. But that wasn't all. Detectives also uncovered a civil suit Ken had been preparing before his death. He was planning to sue several parties involved with a failed motorsport investment. His notes indicated financial losses and possibly fraudulent practices, money disputes that Cindy had originally brushed off as irrelevant. Yet the lawsuit had not been filed. Ken was killed before he could bring it to court. Investigators began connecting the dots. Cindy stood to inherit the house, the land, and the full payout from the insurance policies. She also stood to avoid being pulled into litigation over Ken's planned lawsuit. When detectives re-interviewed her, her demeanor had changed. She was less cooperative, more defensive. She declined to take a polygraph. She referred all further questions to an attorney. But without the murder weapon or eyewitnesses, building a case was still difficult. What the prosecution needed was a behavioral inconsistency or a physical link, something that tied Cindy to the crime beyond her implausible story. In late 2007, a forensic audit of the couple's phone records revealed that a call had been made from the landline inside the house at 5:12 a.m., the morning Ken was found dead. The number dialed was to a voicemail inbox Cindy frequently used for her side business. But in her police statement, she never mentioned going into the house at all that morning, only discovering Ken's body around 8 a.m. after waking up in the RV. That single landline call, undeniably made from within the house, broke her timeline. Why would Cindy place a personal call inside the house where her husband had been shot, and then leave to discover the body hours later? Investigators submitted this timeline anomaly to the district attorney's office, but with no murder weapon and no DNA, the DA declined to charge at that time. Instead, the case remained open, quietly, but never forgotten. Detectives knew they were dealing with someone methodical, patient, and well-versed in how to construct a lie that mimicked confusion. But they also knew lies don't age well. By 2019, investigators with the Marathon County Cold Case team re-examined every detail of Kenneth Judy's 2006 homicide. No longer just looking for new leads, they were reconstructing the crime from the foundation up. One fact had become clear: the scene was staged. Ken was killed by two close-range 20-gauge shotgun blasts while lying in bed. There were no signs of forced entry. Nothing was stolen. No indication of struggle. The house remained locked from the inside. Even the family dogs hadn't barked. From the beginning, the setup appeared too clean, too deliberate, designed to resemble a break-in, yet lacking any traits of an actual intrusion. Cindy Schultz-Udes, Ken's wife, claimed she had slept in a camper outside the house that night due to a headache. But forensic investigators in 2019 found no evidence of recent occupation in that RV. The mattress remained undisturbed. No body heat signatures were recorded, no signs of food, toiletries, or movement. Dust patterns were consistent with prolonged vacancy. Cindy said she found her husband's body the next morning and called 911, but phone records revealed she had waited over an hour before placing the call. She made it not from the RV as she'd claimed, but from inside the house, directly contradicting her story. The crime scene included an unnerving detail: a knife stabbed into Ken's pillow, pinning a torn piece of paper that read, "Bitch." It appeared performative. Profiler input later confirmed. It wasn't consistent with a random act of violence. It was calculated, personal, and designed to mislead. Further review of insurance documents revealed that in the years before the murder, Cindy had adjusted multiple life insurance policies in Ken's name, making herself the sole beneficiary. After his death, she collected nearly $960,000 in payouts. Emails recovered from her computer, sent just days after Ken was found dead, showed she had already begun asserting control over Ken's business holdings and properties. Also concerning, 5 days before the homicide, Cindy had written a check to a private investigator. The purpose remained sealed, but the timing was critical. She never disclosed it in interviews. By 2020, detectives had sufficient evidence to proceed. There was no murder weapon, but motive, means, and opportunity were aligned. Prosecutors charged Cindy with first-degree intentional homicide. At trial in 2021, Cindy's defense leaned on time, arguing that evidence had degraded and no physical link to the murder could be proven. But prosecutors focused on her false alibi, her financial gains, and her complete absence of grief or cooperation. The jury didn't need speculation. They had facts. In November 2021, Cindy Schultz-Udes was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Less than 2 years later, in July 2023, she was killed by her cellmate inside Waupun Correctional Institution. The motive behind the attack was not disclosed, but the arc of the case closed violently, beginning and ending in blood. By early 2021, prosecutors had assembled a case no longer dependent on motive alone. The focus shifted to behavior. Before and after the murder, Cindy Schultz-Udes had told investigators she slept in an RV the night Ken was killed. But forensic examiners found the RV untouched. No disturbed bedding, no thermal evidence, no recent use. Financial records told a sharper story. Just 72 hours after Ken's death, Cindy had filed life insurance claims totaling close to $1 million. She did so calmly, omitting that her husband had died in an open homicide case. Investigators found this highly suspicious, especially given no arrests had been made. They dug deeper. Months before the murder, Cindy had searched for terms like spouse death payout and accidental death policies. She claimed it was for a seminar. The jury didn't believe her. Witnesses added context. Ken had allegedly planned to revise his will and remove Cindy from certain policies. He died before that could happen. His business partner testified that Ken had grown uncomfortable with how Cindy handled their assets. The verdict: guilty of first-degree intentional homicide. But the story didn't end there. In July 2023, Cindy Schultz-Udes was murdered in prison by her cellmate, Taylor Sanchez. The details were sealed, but officials confirmed it was a fatal altercation. From the courtroom to the prison walls, the cycle of violence ended with another body. Cindy Schultz-Udes was sentenced to life without parole in 2021 for the murder of her husband, Ken Juedes. The trial ended years of speculation. For the jury, the evidence spoke clearly. Staged crime scene, conflicting stories, financial motive, and no forced entry. Cindy's story never changed, but it never held up. In prison at Waupun Correctional Institution, Cindy remained distant and showed no remorse. Her appeal failed. The $1 million insurance payout she once claimed was revoked and redistributed to Ken's rightful heirs. Then, on July 11, 2023, Cindy was found dead in her cell. She had been beaten overnight by a fellow inmate, Taylor Sanchez. The autopsy confirmed fatal blunt force trauma. She died the same way she had lived for years, alone and under scrutiny. Some said it was karma. Others saw it as another failure of the system. But for Ken's family, the cycle had finally closed. 2 lives lost, one by a shotgun, the other by silence. This case reminds us, not all killers break in. Some are already inside. In the end, this wasn't just a crime. It was a quiet betrayal from someone trusted the most. Stories like Ken's remind us that evil doesn't always knock. Sometimes it sleeps beside you. If this case has taught me anything, it's that silence and avoidance can cost lives. Pay attention to the patterns, speak up early, and above all, never ignore your instincts. Justice may come late, but truth finds its way. If this video resonated with you, drop a comment telling me what stood out or where you're watching from. If you didn't like it, I still want to hear your thoughts. Hit subscribe if you want more real cases told with clarity and purpose. See you in the next story.